Chapter 2. Establish a creative process. The process for creation must come before the goals. This seems unintuitive until you have been working in the field for some time. After all, most people get into a creative field with some sort of goal in mind, writing a book, recording an album, or something more general like being a painter. There's absolutely nothing wrong with having goals, but you have to ask yourself, how am I going to get there? What am I going to do once I do get there? Having a goal is ultimately meaningless without a method by which you will accomplish it. More than that, a good process will keep you working toward even more goals. Not just your first book, but your 5th or 10th, and will also inform you as to what goals are even possible. Your process and your goals should align. The chief way in which you will evaluate the efficacy of your process is by judging how well it moves you forward toward your goals. A process that doesn't deliver sufficient outputs, or delivers outputs other than those which are desired, must be revised. However, if you are starting out, it can be very difficult to know exactly how to establish a process. I've come up with a few guidelines that I think work across all creative fields, but bear in mind that different fields have different outputs, and different people have different strengths and weaknesses, which will alter how they approach their craft. My specialties, writing and music, will receive some detailed suggestions. For those operating in other fields, such as visual arts, a great way to start establishing a process is to ask professionals in your field as to how they approach work. Here are my general guidelines for any creative process. 1. Make it part of your daily routine. 2. Have a goal for each work session. 3. Have a routine that structures your work time. 4. Create a macro process that involves starting and completing new projects. 5. Make the world aware of your work. From this, you might have ascertained that a creative process exists on 3 levels. 1. What you do while you are working. 2. What you do day to day and week to week. 3. What you do season to season or project to project. In other words, you will need a process that is repeatable every time you sit down to work, a place for that process in your schedule every day, and an understanding of how your process needs to change or reset as you move through the stages on project completion. I'll give some specifics for each one of these. Figuring out how to have a repeatable process at the macro or project level is generally the most advanced thing you will need to learn. Daily routine. Going back to the concept of priorities, I said that creative work needs to be an obligation, similar to everything else in your life, if you want to be making progress towards the completion of a project. For some people who must work schedules that make a daily routine impossible, try to make at least a weekly routine that includes regular work. If you work totally irregular hours, try to make it an obligation, like doing laundry, that you do when you finally have free time. I recommend an hour or more. Usually it takes me at least a few minutes to disengage from the other distractions of life and get into the zone to write. If you're trying to work in 15-minute increments, which I often do at times by necessity, you might be losing a lot of time in transition. But even if you only have 15 minutes, it is still better than nothing. So, pick a time and make it yours. Turn off the phone, close out any social media distractions, and work for the time you have given yourself. It should be a time when you are truly able, mentally and physically, to attend to the task at hand. For me, I write primarily late at night, after my family has gone to sleep. Once I get the kids to bed, I exercise, and then I have my writing time. This works well for me because the ending time is open to change as needed, and the start time can vary depending on how my children are. Sometimes they get to sleep earlier, sometimes later. I always have my time, though. I try to always work at least an hour. If I'm approaching a deadline, I know that I can stay up to get things done. I've had friends who do the opposite. They set an alarm before the children wake up and work a set time until they leave for work or have to attend to the family. This works better for some people who suffer mental fatigue as the day goes on. For me, I'm sharper at night. Do what works for you, and don't be afraid to try out something different. I also end my day with things that aren't work, like a game or book, or occasionally a TV show or a piece of a movie. I don't usually like TV shows. This is a cool down for me so that my mind can stop attending to constant thoughts about my current project and allow me to get some sleep. In general, the more consistently and frequently you are engaging in your work, the faster you will complete a project. Each minute spent is 1 minute closer to the finished product. there's a compound benefit to this regimented approach as well. The more you work, the better you get at working. Working consistently will make your work more effective. When you first start writing, you might be lucky to write 500 words in an hour. After a few weeks, you'll be writing 1,000 words in an hour, effectively doubling your output without changing anything else. This works as well with music. The more you practice, the more effective each session gets, which means you learn music more quickly, which in turn means your progress accelerates. There are limits to this, but if you haven't been working consistently before, you can expect to see extreme growth once you get this down. Getting work time in your schedule is the first and most critical step. In fact, if you just start working without any concrete goal, you will still see a benefit in the form of growth, along with an ability to set your goals more realistically as you better understand your abilities and working speed. More on that later. I'll also write in a bit about alternatives to the daily routine, for those of you for whom that just isn't going to work. Setting up your work environment. The environment you choose to work in can have a large effect on your productivity, usually in the way that it affects your focus and stamina. A workplace that offers up constant interruptions from others will impact your workflow, just as setting up shop among temptations can negatively affect focus. Ideally, both your time and your space will be dedicated, at least in the time that you have scheduled for your work, toward your creative work. For me, this means that during my set-aside work time, my office door is closed and my children are not allowed to interrupt me. It's not perfect, as I can often hear them playing down the hallway, but it is much better than attempting to work on the kitchen table or with a laptop in the living room. Often my wife will take the opportunity to take the kids out of the house, either to something like the park or to visit a relative if it is on the weekend. I also silence my phone and make a point to avoid social media and other distractions while I work. I know that if I want my time to be fully productive, having my mind totally on what I am doing is key. Having a set time and special space makes transitioning to a work-focused mind much easier. When you enter that space, you know you are there to work. It's similar to ideas of sleep hygiene, in which you eliminate from your bedroom activities which are not related to sleep, such as TV, busy work, or reading. To that end, one of the things I started doing a few years ago was choosing to play my video games on a console rather than on my PC. While the graphics are superior on my computer, moving that activity to another room made it much easier for me to get into the correct headspace for creative work. Now when I fire up my computer, my thoughts immediately go to the day's work, not a recent game. This isn't possible with every game type. MMORPGs, massively multiplayer online role-playing games, such as World of Warcraft, don't function well on console, and FPS games are, compared to using a keyboard and a mouse, unplayable using a controller. I've ended up mostly abandoning these playstyles as time has gone on, just as an unintended consequence of this approach. I lament it slightly because I loved playing MMOs, but ultimately work comes first. Not everyone has the option of an office or studio, either because they lack the extra space in their home or can't justify the expense of renting one. For these people, my best advice is to pick a space that is only minimally used for other activities, such as the kitchen table, rather than the living room or bedroom. Make sure that during your special work time, there are none of those other activities going on. If you are working on the kitchen table, get to work after everyone has moved on to other things in the other rooms. This is why most bands start out as garage bands. The garage is a space big enough to hold a band and also has minimal alternative use. Simply move the car out and you have a rehearsal space, at least for the night. Lots of writers in the past had writing sheds, which usually amounted to a tool shed with a typewriter, which works as well. When rehearsing with your band, you won't be distracted by wanting to work on your car, just as you won't be distracted by wanting to do your gardening when sitting in your shed. I should also mention that there are writers who do something which for a long time made no sense to me: writing at Starbucks. I've worked in a variety of suboptimal environments due to the necessities of life, but these aren't usually something I would choose. Starbucks could be a good choice for a writer despite its general noisiness and crowds, because it is a space apart from the home where the mind can stop focusing on domestic burdens. The noise is, at some point, more like white noise, something that becomes unnoticed and drowns out detailed, distracting noises. There's also the benefit of distraction at Starbucks. This may sound counterintuitive, but having small opportunities for selected distractions can actually help workflow, Shifting your focus for a few moments can give you a release of the tension of work, making the moments you focus more enjoyable and productive. Don't forget that focus is like a muscle, and you aren't going to be extremely strong with your focus early into your career when you haven't spent any time flexing it. This selected distraction could be something as simple as a window to look out of while you work, or it could be a cat that likes to sit on top of your chair. The important thing is that the distraction is not long-lasting or of substantial relative interest. Watching people talk in Starbucks, or watching people walk by on occasion, is this sort of distraction. More interesting things, like watching TV, are not advisable unless you are doing something that requires so little of your focus that you can do with not attending to the task very much, like running on a treadmill. At one point, I watched television while practicing guitar. This allowed me to focus for only a few minutes at a time when it was hard to do so. It also allowed me to get through some very brutal repetitions without getting bored to tears. I learned classical guitar tremolo in just a few days this way, repeating the pattern over and over while watching the nightly hour of The Simpsons. Tremolo is a very specific pattern, thumb, then ring, middle, and index fingers on a single string, that must be played at high speed. High repetition with little focus was acceptable for this activity. It would not be acceptable for something that required lots of thought, such as music composition. Practice zombies. Have a goal for each session. Don't go into the practice room without an idea of what you want to do there. Let me explain from the perspective of music. If you have ever been involved in music in school, you might have had your instructor tell you to practice and complain that the band or choir isn't practicing enough. Rarely does an instructor tell you what you ought to do when practicing, or more importantly, what you should expect to get done during a session. Most music departments at the university level are haunted by what I call practice zombies. These are students who know that they need to spend time practicing, 2 hours or some other large chunk of time their instructor says they must. So they drift into a practice room when they have nothing else to do, pull out their instrument, and do what amounts to nothing for a while. It may look like they are practicing, but they aren't. They are usually doing a few things. 1. Playing scales. 2. Doing long tones, even funnier if they play clarinet or saxophone. 3. Working through etudes. 4. Playing pieces that they already know. 5. Staring into space. 6. Chatting with other students who walked by. Perhaps you have seen some of these students in the wild. They need not be students either. I knew a fellow who used to stop by the practice rooms every day because he knew he needed it in his routine. Another friend of mine said about him, "I see him in there every day, but he never gets any better." Practice zombies are focusing on doing things that are easy, rather than things that are hard, things which will move them forward and create growth. You should sound bad in the practice room because you should be focusing on things that you can't do yet. Practice zombification was compounded in students who practiced outside. If people are listening, you are going to turn your session into a performance, focusing on what you can already do to avoid embarrassment. What they should be doing is setting goals for their session. Example: 1. Play measures 32 through 40 100% cleanly at 80% tempo or faster. 2. Play measure 52 cleanly at 100% tempo. 3. Play the A section by memory. 4. Play through my newest repertoire with the time remaining. This approach to practice ensures there is always not enough practice time, but this is realistic. There's never quite enough time. Spending your time with this order of priorities, remember the importance of ordering priorities? It's important for work time too. Ensures that whatever time you do spend practicing is always moving you forward by the maximum amount. You are always doing whatever is the highest priority, usually the most difficult part, or a piece you will be performing soon, and saving unimportant things for when you have accomplished your primary goal. Notice that run-throughs are saved for the end, not the beginning. Your run-through, ideally, would inform what you need to work on for the next day or week. While this approach to work time cannot readily be transferred outside of music performance, the approach certainly can be. Always ask yourself, 1. What needs my attention now? 2. What needs my attention today? 3. What needs my attention at some point? Then you structure your work to reflect those needs. For me, there is often something that has to be done immediately. Usually it is a task I prefer not to address, like fixing something on my website or making sure my content is visible and active. That may seem the opposite of what a prolific writer should be doing, like working on books, but it is imperative that I keep my marketing machine going if I want to sell books. That means I need to make frequent, ideally daily, content. After that, I work on my daily goal. I always write 1,000 words minimum on my current book, more if I can or if I feel I'm in the zone, or much less if I am in the editing phase of a book. That's part of the macro process. 1,000 words, in truth, is not very much, but it adds up big time over the long term. Then if I still have time, I work on other long-term stuff, setting up and optimizing emails, ads, and social media profiles, etc. For writers, I recommend you set a daily word count goal. If you are new to the discipline, start at 500 words, about one single-spaced page in Times New Roman 12-point font. If that doesn't take up your entire budgeted time, try 1,000 words, then 1,500. For reference, Stephen King wrote 2,500 words per day in his prime, and he is massively prolific. As a retiree, he writes 1,500. This is a perfect example of how having a daily routine and a daily goal can net huge returns over time. Some pulp authors claim that they can push 10,000 words in a day. I've done this before, but it is unrealistic for most people who won't be able to focus that intently for such a long time, day after day. We'll talk more about sprints, where you do large amounts of work in a short time, later on. The point I want to get across here is that you should set a modest goal in terms of word count and stick to it. Consistency with each session is more important than having a big day. Also, you should never edit while you are writing a draft. That will turn you into the literary version of a practice zombie. For artists, visual arts, such as painting or graphic novels, are a different beast. It's good to set a goal for what you are doing, but sometimes those goals are a bit difficult to define. How does one define progress on a detailed painting? I've discovered that the most consistent artists usually have some way of defining progress. They will break a painting down into its parts and have a goal for each part. For instance, on day 1, they will sketch the planned painting. On day 2, they will perform a basic color study of the piece, changing what details they need. On day 3, they will begin the final piece, usually starting with the subject or a portion of the subject, for instance, the entirety of the figure minus details. Then they add in each part, the face, the background, the clothing details, and final touches, in order to complete a piece. You'll have to find a way of breaking things down in this way, depending on the type of art you are producing. For comic artists and graphic novel artists, goals might be easier to set. First, you have to have a basic story sketch of your planned book, with dialogue hopefully already written. Then you work on pencils, then inking. From there, you can decide what you should get done each day. Say 1 page fully inked once you are working on the final project. The greats used to put out large volumes simply because they were on a timeline for release, and designed their art to match the necessity of a release schedule. This might mean using Baroque detail only on large panels or full page splashes, and cutting out the background on most passing panels. Having a similar approach will help you to decide what panels need high detail and which ones can have a simpler approach without disrupting the flow of the story. For music composers, music composition, to me, is just as nebulous as art as far as tracking progress and making small goals goes, as each composer has a different approach to constructing their music. Some people start with a melody, then add accompaniment. Others, like me, write almost everything all at once. Defining a goal is still important, though. If I'm composing, I try to complete one section, usually 16 to 64 measures, depending on the piece, per day or more, so I can finish a piece in a weekend. Then, once finished, I edit the music and put on all the final details. If I am creating a score, I leave out all articulations in other directions until the end, as trying to write all of that in, especially in a score writing program, is very cumbersome and takes me out of the flow of composition. Work routines. Besides actually making time to work, it is a good idea to have a specific routine for your work time itself. This will ensure that you get into your creative headspace quickly and reliably, and that you are able to disengage from the project when you need to. Here's a good example from the music field that I use to suggest to my students. 1. Warm-up, 5 minutes. 2. Etudes, 10 minutes. 3. New music, 30 minutes. 4. Run-throughs, 10 to 15 minutes. 5. Notes for the next day. You can see with this routine that you have something that gets you into the space to play, something which helps growth, the etudes or pieces of music designed to test technique. Then you are immediately doing work on something new, reserving run-throughs of any complete pieces for the end. This fits the priorities I mentioned earlier and will prevent the student from entering the realm of the practice zombie. Writing down what to work on the next day releases your mind and lets you focus on your next task. It could also be easily expanded to take up more than an hour, or less, by expanding or shrinking everything. When I was actively performing, I spent almost no time on run-throughs of established material, since I performed that repertoire live several times per week. For writing, I do something different. 1. Read the previous day's work. Correct things if needed. 2. Pre-write. Think about what I'm writing, and maybe write down a sentence of what is going to happen. 3. Write until the word count goal is met. 4. Read or play a game. Playing a game might seem unrelated, but it serves the same point as reading a book. Not enhancing my craft, but rather getting my mind off of the work so I can sleep. I write at night. When I skip that transition, I often have trouble sleeping and lose the time I would spend reading anyway. Good art routines involve activities similar to music. 1. Warm-up sketch. 2. Study. 3. Current project. 4. Decompressing transition. The point of the routine during work time is to ensure your time is used wisely for both growth and progress, as well as to avoid losing time in transition. Macro and meta processes. Here's where things begin to get complicated. The macro process involves managing creative output, not at the daily level, but at the level of your projects as well as the cycle of multiple projects. If you have never finished a project before, expect a lot of growing pains in this area, even if you have a daily routine down and working for you. Going back to the visual arts, creating a painting might involve 3 phases. 1. Sketch or plan of the work. 2. Color study or studies. 3. Full painting. Being able to execute the sequence over and over will net a large catalog of high-quality paintings, even if you are working rather slowly. Bigger projects like a comic book require more complicated phases. 1. Script writing. 2. Storyboarding, sketching, paneling, dialogue plans. 3. Pencils. 4. Inks. 5. Colors. 6. Letters. 7. Revisions. 8. Publication. That last phase, publication, could be a big one, especially if you were independent, involving formatting the comic, transmitting it to the printer, marketing it, and possibly shipping the books to stores or customers. Maybe that could be a final phase. Fulfillment. Publishing a book involves 4 phases. 1. Planning. 2. Drafting. 3. Revision. 4. Publication. Most people think writing is just phase 2, the drafting phase, but in reality, writing is all 4 of these phases. You need to plan your book as well as your process. You need to actually put the words to paper, drafting. Then you need to revise and refine your work. And finally, you need to do the complicated publication phase. Writing a book or putting out a comic is such a huge project, especially for those who have no experience with the macro process, that many people get lost somewhere along the way, abandoning their comic because they didn't realize they needed a script to start, or getting writer's block because they didn't plan out the story for their novel ahead of time. Skipping steps or not understanding the macro can set you back in terms of both time and money. I've seen artists lose months of productivity in failing to manage their macro process and end up with very upset customers when they mess up the publication process. Producing an album has a similarly daunting macro structure. 1. Composition. 2. Pre-production rehearsal. 3. Pre-production recording. Demo. 4. Primary production and recording. 5. Mixing/editing. 6. Mastering. 7. Publication/distribution/marketing. Even today, when it is possible to cut several steps, like pre-production rehearsal and recording, artifacts from when you used to have to rent expensive studios by the hour, recording an album is a very big undertaking. Existing at an even larger level is the management of the entire creative operation, including the cycle of multiple projects and what, if anything, happens between projects. If the project is the macro process, then this is the meta process, the process of processes. For a serious musical act, the end of an album would also be the beginning of a tour cycle in support of that album, which would end and signal the beginning of the album recording cycle yet again. Of course, there are music videos you need to somehow produce within that process. In the realm of writing, the meta involves planning things like series, where and when you will construct short fiction, how you will market books, how projects will overlap, and how you will interact with your readership. For someone like me who does projects across various forms of media, the meta is often in flux. When I come out with a book, I have to both promote the book by producing content across the internet, and I have to begin the next book cycle. In fact, I try to put starting my next work as close to finishing the last one as possible, sometimes even beginning my next project before my current one goes live. The reason? Something that is very disruptive to the meta process: post-project depression. Post-project depression. This is a very real phenomenon I have experienced myself, and you probably have as well. When you finally complete a long-term goal, whether it is something like a book or something else significant such as finishing college, it is very common to feel an emotional high that quickly turns around and becomes an emotional low. I think there are a few reasons for this. First, any emotional high is going to make returning to normal feel like a letdown. Second, when all yourself is invested in something, completing that thing is the same as losing it. It no longer occupies your mind. It no longer gives you purpose, and so a sense of emptiness sets in. This is why managing your process at the meta level is critical. Starting your next project right after you finish your previous one will keep that driven part of yourself focused on something important. This has the added bonus of making you less focused on the reception of your previous project. It may seem odd to want to dull your receptiveness to feedback. After all, you've worked hard and you want your work to have an impact on others. But such detachment is in practice very beneficial. When you've put your whole self into something, having any response other than glowing praise is going to feel like a spiritual attack. It's only with a little bit of disconnect from that project that you can healthily receive criticism about it, or be at peace with some people not liking it. Something else you can do to avoid depression is to actively engage in the consumption of art, something else that I consider a key to prolific creativity, and I will cover in detail in Chapter 8. Giving yourself a vacation after finishing a significant work in which you consume the things you love will inspire you to get to work on your next project in addition to being an enjoyable activity on its own. Show your results to the world. The final part of any creative process is publication. I personally do not see any point in working to create a profound work of art without the intention of putting it out into the world to affect and inspire others. Public display of your work is a frightening idea if you have never put out your work to strangers, but it is absolutely necessary for both the sense of completion to feel real and for personal growth. Some people undoubtedly will not like what you did, but what is more important is seeing that there are people who enjoyed it and found value. Early on, those who enjoy your work are going to be the ones who point you to what is special about your approach. In my experience, highly negative reviews say little about the product and are not constructive at all. Instead, they are emotive and reactionary, thus they tend to create an emotional reaction for the creator. The most useful critical reviews are those that are midline, since they will usually include what points of strength your art has. Those are the things you want to focus on cultivating. The point is, though, that you must go through the risk of showing off what you've accomplished, or else it would be like it never existed at all. Your creations deserve to live. Alternatives to routine. For some people, a routine is suboptimal. For instance, a touring musician may have trouble composing on the road. If you are in the military, deployment will be a major obstacle to any sort of creative productivity. For other people, routine feels too oppressive to feel creative with, though if that is you, I urge you to still attempt a routine approach for at least a few weeks or months. What else is there, though? One option in the face of routine difficulty is the concept of a sprint, or what I call the boot camp mindset. The boot camp mindset. You can tolerate almost anything for a short amount of time. Tolerance of discomfort is largely a function of time, not intensity. As a creative, you can engage in short-term bouts of extreme work. Michael Moorcock famously could write a book over a weekend. Robert Jordan supposedly could write a book over his spring break. You can also see this at work when you see an established, experienced band write and record a full album in a matter of weeks. Sammy Hagar recorded the album I Never Said Goodbye in 10 days in order to fulfill corporate obligations, freeing him to join Van Halen. When you engage in a sprint like this, it must be for a short amount of time. Generally, I think 6 weeks is the upper limit for extreme schedules, low sleep, and high work hours with intense focus. I arrived at this window based on the practices of militaries around the world, who almost always limit their highly intensive training programs to 6 weeks. This is why I call it the boot camp mindset. You are committing to a short-term but intensive program. I've pushed the 6-week limit personally to get projects shipped at certain times, but that is always followed by a transition to some other focus. Some artists I've talked to run this way all the time. They write for 6 or 8 weeks out of the year, and otherwise they are doing other things. Or nothing at all. If you attempt a sprint, and especially if you attempt one when you have a lot of time on your hands, such as during a vacation, be aware that having the focus necessary to be productive is difficult to maintain. Trying to work for 8 hours straight is more difficult than trying to work for 2 hours 4 times during the day. Plan to adjust your process during a sprint and pay attention to what things in your temporary routine are working and what things are not. What is certain, though, is that during a sprint, you have to be working not only consistently, but relentlessly. There is no sprint if you don't show up every day.